I want to begin by indicating to you that it is an honor and a privilege for me to address you today dealing with this extraordinarily important issue of strengthening the healthcare infrastructure on the continent of Africa. You have heard brilliant remarks here this morning, so I've been rewriting my speech in my head based on these brilliant statements. And I want you to know that I will make no effort to compete with my colleagues here, who have laid out in very clear and articulate terms problem and challenges. So in the few moments that I have with you, what I choose to do is to lay out context, the broader context within which we meet, to lay out perspective. And then hopefully at the end, to provide you with some general thoughts about path forward. Firstly, we've come together on many occasions to talk about issues that confront our brothers and sisters in the countries that comprise the continent of Africa. And more often than not, we've come to these meetings viewing Africa as client states, recipients of aid. I want to offer 5 observations that hopefully will change that perspective. Number 1, when you look at the economics of the world, the growth that has slowed down and in some ways dropped. Across the continent of Africa, the average growth has been 5% or above. Enormous implications going forward. At a time when consumer spending has gone down in countries around the world, in Africa it has gone up. I see all these computers and smartphones in the room here today. Number 3, the reality is that the minerals that are significant in the development of smartphones and computers are in abundance on the continent of Africa, which means that the technological future of the world in many ways is in the hands of Africa. Number 4, at a time when the growth of young people in the world, around the world, is declining, the percentage of young people on the continent of Africa is growing, which means that down the road, the leaders of the world, the visionaries of the world, in large part, will come from Africa. Lastly, research indicates, and some of my colleagues have already spoken to it, I would underscore it for the purposes of emphasis. Only a fraction of the power that can be harnessed from the power of the sun, solar power, and harnessing the power of the wind energy, can create enough energy virtually for the entire world. So when you look at the challenges of climate change, think about the potential of the continent of Africa, where the sun shines mightily, to harness the power of that energy on not just a small project basis, but on a full-scale basis across the continent. The potential for the energy, for the development of countries in Africa and around the world, the implications for the future of this planet, it absolutely staggers the imagination. And we've only begun to tap it. So when you put those 5 points together, we can no longer, in my humble opinion, view Africa as a collection of client states that we must treat as welfare recipients. And we all know what that is in the context of American debate. But rather countries that will be significant leaders as the world evolves into the future. Trust me, The continent of Africa is going to loom in the future in ways that we haven't even begun to think about, but we must. Because everything has changed except the way many of us think. My second observation, context for this meeting. We live in a world that is rapidly becoming interrelated, interdependent, where we are indeed mutually vulnerable. That manifests itself when we look at global economics, global health, global terrorism, cybersecurity, and climate change. In focusing on these issues that, at the end of the day, ultimately are interrelated and intertwined. They're not isolated from each other. They flow across lines. Will require our universality, which means that we come together not, let's help this guy, but let's help each other. How can the continent of Africa disappear and the planet Earth not disappear? How can the ecology of Africa deteriorate and the ecology of the planet not deteriorate? How can the health on the continent of Africa deteriorate and the health of the planet not deteriorate? We're interdependent, interrelated, and mutually vulnerable. Which leads me to this. In the context of the AIDS pandemic, I advocated a Marshall Plan, HIV Marshall Plan for Africa. Fast forward to 2015, I would like to change the name. Ubuntu, which is a term used, an African term that connotes the interconnectedness, the oneness of us all. Bishop Tutu of South Africa made the point that we cannot achieve our humanity in isolation, that we achieve our humanity based on our ability to understand our interrelated, interdependent, interconnected, mutual vulnerability of each other. It is in that reality of our oneness. Okay. So let's call it the Ubuntu plan. Number one, with respect to existing programs, and I only underscore what's been stated here earlier, our job here is to support, to accelerate, to prioritize, to expand existing programs. Whether that's dealing with the bricks and mortar, whether that's dealing with the training of people, what it is expanding on the brilliance and the successes that have been achieved and benefiting from the mistakes that have been made in the existing programs. Secondly, my brilliant friend, Alan Herman, and I were having lunch the other day, and he said very simply but very brilliantly, and I said, hold it, got my pen out and wrote it down. It is in the context of our lives. It is the context of our lives that affect our health, not just the healthcare delivery system. It is in the context of our lives. We live in an economic context. So poverty plays a major role in the health of people. So dealing with the problem of poverty, eradicating poverty, look how difficult it is for us in this wealthy nation of the United States to even use the term. Most politicians can't even pronounce the word poverty. They go pop, 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 middle class. So I'm not suggesting that this is something easy, but it is something difficult but must be addressed. So decent jobs, good housing, clean water, affordable and healthy food. All these things matter because people live in an economic context, and that economic context is important. People live in an ecological context, in an environmental context. So lack of sanitation, shortages of water and resources become important. Some have made the argument, for example, in Lake Chad, which shrunk mightily, had an enormous impact economically, health-wise, and contribute to the rise of terrorism. So here, where people live out their lives in the context of the environment, it also has implications far beyond all of that. So that becomes very, very significant and very important. People live their lives in the context of violence and conflict. Think about all the military people who've come home with post-traumatic stress disorder. When I look on the continent of Africa and I see people living their daily lives in the context of violence and terror and conflict, I think, wow, how can people survive? The tragedy of killing and raping and plundering on a daily basis and having to live that life every day. Even in my lowest moments, I realized, my God, there but for the grace of God go I. How can people survive in that kind of environment? But that kind of environment has enormous implications for health. We see that everywhere. So we have to address it. We have to not only talk about developing a healthcare delivery system, but how do we deal locally and nationally and regionally and globally around violent conflicts that endanger human lives, that torture people's minds, that ravage their bodies? So our job here is extraordinary. And as I said earlier, because we live in this interconnected, interrelated world, so that terrorism and economics and healthcare and the environment and cybersecurity, all these things are interrelated and interdependent, creates a mutual vulnerability for us. So our Ubuntu plan must address the existing problems, deal with the root causes of health issues, deal with the context within which people live their lives, and then thirdly, clearly leading to the fact that we must now develop stronger relationships between African countries and the rest of the world and with each other. Relationships that are based upon mutual respect, collaboration, and the willingness and the ability to engage in co-development. Because it is in understanding the mutuality of our struggle that we will ultimately survive and prevail. I want to finally make some points that I've been lecturing at Howard University for the last couple of years, and young people ask me, the most frequent question they ask me is, what is the difference between your generation when you were our age and our generation? And I'm going to conclude on that. And I said, a very good question. First difference, our generation never thought about time. Time was not an issue for us. We just got up and fought. We were trying to change the world. We weren't dealing with time. But this generation must now deal with time because the world is changing with such great speed that there is an urgency for change that we didn't consider when we were young people. So the first difference is one of urgency. Secondly, our generation used to say, I never met a bigot in a foxhole. You know what a foxhole is when you're shooting at something. And the concept is very simple. When confronted with a mutual enemy, you have a tendency to overcome your differences. Have you ever seen a space alien movie? You know, there are no bigots. It's just earthlings versus aliens. And suddenly, white folks and black folks and everybody, we all get together because we have a common threat. Right? Fast forward to 2015. The definition of the foxhole has changed. The foxhole is the entire planet, and we're all in it. And we're all in it together. Ubuntu. Interconnected, interrelated, interdependent, mutually vulnerable world. So our challenge as young people was the sectarian battles that we had to fight. This generation's struggle is how do you bring your arms around the entire human family? Because it is in the universality of the struggle that you will survive and that you will prosper. So while we continue to fight sectarian battles, at the end of the day, we must get beyond them as quickly as possible because there are larger universal struggles that we must engage in that ultimately will help us achieve our ability to go forward in the world. Another difference, Martin Luther King told us, freedom, justice, peace, equality, eradicating poverty, healthy community is the right thing, the moral thing, the ethical thing, the principled thing to do. This generation must do it because it is the only thing to do. Yesterday's principle is now today's imperative. You must achieve these objectives because your very survival is at stake. You don't have time to sit around and debate these matters. You know, we're still talking about issues we fought over 50 years ago. You don't have that kind of time. Right? So when you put all this together, the significance of this event today is that we are not only coming together to help our sisters and brothers on the continent of Africa address the totality of the issues of health that affect their lives, but we're coming together for our own survival as well. Because it is in their survival that we survive. It is in their health that we are healthy. It is in their ability to live a sustained life that we can achieve sustainability. For ourselves, for our children, and our children's children, let today and this week's gathering be significant in helping us to understand that ultimately it is in the recognition of our oneness that we will achieve the kind of world that is worthy of all of us. I join you in that effort.
We want to take a couple questions of Congressman Dellums. I told you he's dynamic. We want to take a couple questions for Congressman Dellums. I got the first question. I got the mic, I got the question. Mr. Dellums, you talked about foxholes. What do you think it would take to move the U.S. Congress today to support a strengthened healthcare system? We all see how the Congress is fragmented and fighting each other. We're now entering a political year. What is it going to take for Republicans, Democrats, and Congress? You know Congress. You've been there many years. You know the dynamics. I know when you were in Congress, you worked with Newt Gingrich, who was a well-known Republican antagonist, if you will, but you got along well with him, you know. What do you think it would take to get this U.S. Congress to better support the strengthening of healthcare infrastructure in Africa?
That is a good question. There's no simple answer. And let me step back and then come into it. I was in a classroom, and one of the young students at Howard said, I voted for President Obama because I wanted to see what he could do. And I didn't deal with that issue until maybe 15 minutes later, and I came back to it. And I said, you know, you guys elected President Obama and went home and turned on the TV to say, okay, let's see what he can do. That's not politics, that's entertainment. What would America look like? What would the world look like? Would we be here talking about healthcare delivery system on the continent of Africa if we had not only elected this guy, but stayed in the streets and created a movement? 50 years ago, President Johnson went to Howard University and gave an incredible historic speech. We must eradicate all forms of racial injustice and strike a mighty blow against poverty. Do you think he gave that speech alone? He gave that speech because there was a movement that had emerged that gave him not only the strength, but the vision to stand there and make that statement. So my answer to you may not be a simple answer, but it's get back out there, build a movement. You see, I served in the Congress when we actually could shake hands and say deal and you could take it to the bank. You know, when Ron Dellums and Strom Thurmond could actually work it out. I know Martin Luther King could say, I can't believe this is really happening. But there was no magic. People were out there holding people accountable. So this is not entertainment. Politics requires engagement. Citizenship requires involvement. Okay? It is an everyday alertness. So my summary answer to you is we help Africa by standing up, by saying to the powers that be that we are here and we will hold you accountable. We will not just go home and turn on the television to see you engage in the spectator sport of partisan politics. No, we will be there to make sure that you address the policy issues of our time. Finally, we will have the significant policy debate that you seek once we bring integrity back to the political process. Okay? Now, what I've been advocating, and since I have this podium, I'll advocate it here. I'm old enough to know that the Voting Rights Act was 50 years old. Suppose you wrote a new Voting Rights Act. What would it look like? How would you define representation? Back in the day, we said, we want black representation. And conservatives, white conservatives, they heard that. They came back to us and they said, we understand you want a black district. We want black representation. Well, we carved out this district. You can have this black district for the next 100 years. So they gave us one and they took 12. So who got screwed in that process? So how would you define representation in 2015? Would you keep the electoral college? Would you make voting mandatory? Would you keep the polls open not for a few hours but for several days to allow everybody to vote? Would you give people in prison, behind prison walls, the right to vote? Would you open up the process? Would you maintain the integrity of it? And I believe that if a group of people ever stood up and put a Voting Rights Act before the American people that respected their humanity, that understood Ubuntu, the interrelatedness and connectedness, you would create a movement that would emerge in this country that would not only bring political integrity, but force the policy discussions around health care and poverty and other issues that are not being talked about because there is no integrity to the process and there is no movement. That's my long answer, but that's my answer. Thank you.
Can we have one or two other questions or comments from the floor?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Saliu Barry. I'm from Guinea, Mandela Washington Fellow. My question is about the picture of Africa on the western side. Most people we met here when I came here, I noticed people think Africa is a continent of disease or one country. So most people do not know Africa, and it's affecting the business development, the business partnership, and small business owners. So it's making very difficult for Africa to sell their product on the Western side. It's making it priceless. So I want to know, in your opinion, how can we change that picture?
Okay.
Yeah, I think I, in part, addressed that in my earlier remarks. Number one, you're absolutely right. We tend to say Africa as if it's one country. And I think in my remarks, I tried to say, as I moved along, countries that comprise the continent of Africa. And there are different countries with different contributions, right? Different exports, different minerals, different, sources of wealth and capacity. That's very important. The other point, as I was trying to say, is that we have to continue to keep repeating the points that I made earlier. The economy in the countries across Africa is growing. Consumerism in the countries of Africa is growing. The minerals on the continent of Africa dictate the future of technology in the world that needs to be communicated and exploited in many ways. In too many instances, it's been exploited the other way. Countries in the continent of Africa have been exploited for their resources and not much given back to them. And so you see people living in the proximity of great wealth, but living in great poverty. We got to overcome that by getting the message out that this is the continent of the future. These are countries of the future. You have to keep making that point and making that statement. One thing we learned in Western society, you keep telling people over and over, they eventually get it. That's what Wall Street's all about. So have African Wall Street. Talk about what the realities really are and do it from a position of strength, not as the client state. Okay?